I appreciate this, guys. The first person I'm going to thank is going to be our head coach and sporting director, Greg Berhalter, because I'm going to present here on a topic that requires a massive, massive cultural shift when you're going to bring it into professional athletics, especially the soccer environment. And I've gotten nothing but unconditional support from him. He's become a dear friend, but it's also the entire staff behind us. You know, in this particular circumstance, if there's just one staff member that doubts, combined with a player that doubts, now all of a sudden you have kinks in your armor, and it's very, very difficult because this is a massive cultural shift to do something like this within soccer, and I'm blessed to have the support that I have from him. So I'm excited about that. In addition to that, you know, not once has either of our consulting physicians, our chief medical officer, Pete Edwards, or our general physician, Tom Hospital, neither of them have ever tried to talk me out of doing this, and so I appreciate that very much. It takes that type of support. And Dr. Volek, I'll get to your team at the end for sure. I owe you guys a huge thank you. But so in general, Dr. Noakes, I'm glad you're here. I'm very pleased you're here. And the reason why is because 7 to 8 years ago, it was your tweets and some of your articles on groupthink that really made me go down this path. And I've put some of my favorite quotes about groupthink here because in general, sports science was very, very guilty of this. They're still very guilty of this. I think we're climbing our way out of it, to be fair, but in the area of diet and nutrition, I felt like we were in dire need for change. But it was your work, and it was the things that I was following on social media from you that really made me think there's probably a way we can be doing this much, much better. And so when I came back from Europe, I sat down with Greg. I've gotten the job with Columbus Crew Soccer Club for the second time around now, and he says, like every coach says, I want to be the fittest team in the league, on the planet, on any planet, right? And every head coach I've been with has said the same thing, but I knew for a fact that he was adamant. But if you're really going to analyze what that takes, be fitter than any team in the league, you know, you have to think about what, I'm trying to translate what those words really mean. And what those words meant to me was, I need you to separate from the group, right? And separating from the group is not easy. If you're going to separate from the group, you have to be willing to live in the margins, because at this level where you're trying to separate yourself, let's say from the top 6 teams, top 7 teams in the league, there's going to be certain areas where you're not going to separate yourself. All of them train hard. All of them are giving everything they can. So what is it going to take for you to do that? You have to be able to be willing to live in these margins. And then on top of that, you have to be willing to do what others aren't willing to do. Not only the coaches, but the players. And it's a conversation we had with them. And I painted that picture to them. I said, okay, this is what you guys want, but I can't have you telling me what you're not willing to do, because that won't work either, right? And then lastly, there's this willingness to make mistakes, learn from them, and keep going. And I think we've got an incredibly talented group of coaches, an incredibly talented group of players as well, and I owe it to the players for their commitment to new things. So I thought, how are we going to accomplish this? I really felt like there's this need to return to the basics. You know, what are these true energy requirements of the sport? You know, we've been told several things about the lactate requirements, and I'm not so sure that it's such a lactic sport anymore. And I think over 16 years of this, I'm pretty convinced it's actually not that much of a lactic sport, but there's this huge, robust need for an aerobic base. You have to have this ability to execute repeated sprint ability, as Dr. Egan was talking about. And I think, you know, from my perspective, I felt like it had to go back down to a cellular level, to a metabolic level, if we're really, really going to make a difference, if we're going to separate ourselves. You know, the 2 basic questions for me were, what's the volume of energy available, right? And when we start looking at those available energy requirements, where can we tap into the most energy available, right? What's the biggest volume we can find, and what's the quickest way for us to resynthesize that energy and be in a position to be able to, again, execute these 2 or 3% margins that are going to give us this edge. And so for me, I felt like it kept taking me to mitochondrial density. It kept taking me to these metabolic processes of producing more energy. And can we increase aerobic capacity? Can we increase the rate of creatine phosphate resynthesis? Can we have glycogen sparing? Can we have all these things that we know are going to separate us from the rest of the league? And where we settled through consultation and many hours of work with Dr. Volek and his team is that we felt like we needed to incorporate a low carbohydrate, high fat diet with this team. And so that's what we embarked to do. The way we initially said it was I wanted to split the methods up between preseason and in-season because there's cultural influences that I need to make sure that I satisfy with this team. There's individual superstitions that players have. There's the individual experiences that they have become accustomed to, that they cling to. They anchor to certain things that they say, this is what I need to do to be successful, and how do I avoid breaking that trust between me and them? And the first thing was I said, well, the one thing they're used to is that on preseason, they know they have no control. They know in preseason, it's all us, right? And I have a 6-week preseason, and that was a perfect time frame for me in my discussions with Jeff. He agreed. And from this standpoint, we had total caloric control. If I have that in my locker, then I feel like I'm in a good place. And where we ended up looking at, in terms of carbohydrate loading itself, we wanted to stay somewhere between 40 and 80 grams of carbohydrates a day. And that was depending on how we were matching these things up to the training load in and of itself as we worked our way through. We planned and incorporated specific periods where we were doing stationary bike sessions that were completely glycogen depleted. We wanted to make sure that we were able to bring in extra training sessions unloaded in terms of joint loading so that we weren't putting the players at risk, but we knew we were making metabolic differences. So we incorporated these planned bike sessions under glycogen depletion. And then the main thing we wanted to do with the players was just educate. And for us, we had to start with wellness and lifestyle first, not performance when we're discussing it with these players, because in general, what I felt was going to make it stick long-term and make it sustainable was them to understand that we're trying to take them in a direction, not only for their own performance now, but just for their own longevity. And I will say this as a caveat, one of the greatest consequences of us starting this program is several of our coaching staff, including our head coach, has adopted low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets into their lives, into their families' lives. The players themselves have incorporated this, not only our own lives, but convincing their fathers and mothers to do the same thing. So I feel like what we've done from an educational standpoint might be the most rewarding thing we've done so far in terms of being able to at least give information that we know ethically we're making a difference in these guys' lives. And just as Dr. Noakes said, he probably was the cause of his own type 2 diabetes. I was afraid that I was actually driving diabetes as a strength coach, as a fitness coach, with the dietary advice I was giving to players before I had switched my own thought paradigm. So at this point, it was now about convincing them that this is what we need to do. And in order to do that, my advice is always do it with enthusiasm. Our first words were to them is, guys, out of all the changes we've made, this is the one we're most excited about. And together as a coaching staff, that's what we put forward in front of them. Right, the excitement, the enthusiasm. And then we all did it together. The staff did it together. The players did it together. It's 6 weeks of all of us doing this at the same time. And that's how we kicked this off. And that was in 2015, preseason of 2015. And we haven't looked back since. But in general, it's very, very important, in my opinion, to make sure that it's the whole entire group, players and staff, doing it together. And so these are some of the targets that we looked at once we got in season. We wanted to make sure that within the context of knowing what the sport is, that we weren't moving too forward too quickly. So this is where we started. And 60% of our calories were coming from fat as we really started to get information back from the players in terms of how we were doing, how we were educating, and how they were implementing it at home. And we started to make sure that as a part of this whole process, we were monitoring them correctly too. If we're going to introduce a new diet, somewhat controversial, we wanted to make sure that we were collecting cholesterol levels, that we were monitoring them correctly. And Jeff's advice to do NMR was fantastic because it provided us so much feedback. And just as a caveat, the results we got back from the NMR tests were fantastic. And across the board, it matched up very, very nicely to the FASTER study, to be fair. We had about 80% of the group where their lipid levels were completely normal anyway. There was no cholesterol issues at all, despite the changes in macronutrients. But that 15 to 20% of the rest of the group matched up to the FASTER study very nicely. Very high elevated, LDL total particle counts. But when you looked at the makeup of LDL, there was a very low amount of small LDL particles. There was a very large amount of large LDL particles, much like Dr. Krause was talking about yesterday in his presentation. And then the average particle size was very large, but the biggest thing we saw was an amazing change in their insulin resistance. Fantastic numbers as far as their insulin resistance was concerned. And then there was a pocket, small, maybe 1 to 2 players a year, where we had some things that didn't look right, where we had triglycerides were high, HDLs were low, despite being fairly confident that they were compliant. And through some different work and some different suggestions, we looked at ApoB, ApoA, and ratios. And if you ask me why, the only thing I can tell you is because Jeff told me so. So that's why we did it. I still don't know what they are, but that's not my responsibility. Jay, our team dietitian, Jeff, and our physicians do a great job of making sure that all these numbers work in a way where we know our players are safe, and that's the most important thing for us. So then, this is the part I usually start with, because this is the first time I've been in a crowd where you guys are actually going to support the things I'm saying. So usually when I'm in different circumstances, I start with the stats, because it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to argue with me. But and just so you guys know, don't be nervous. The stats are good, just so you know. So I don't, because some of you look nervous. But the first thing I'll start with, team compliance. So in 2017, we wanted to see whether we were actually fat adapted. I understand this is 2 years later. We were pretty confident, but we wanted some hard evidence. So 93% of our players were compliant with all the meals we provided for them at the training ground, which is breakfast, lunch, snacks, any time in that period between breakfast and when they leave. We feel about 2/3 of their diet was provided by us. 80% of them are compliant at home when they're cooking their meals for themselves. I'll go deeper into this in a second. And then 88% were compliant when you combined eating out, eating at home, so on and so forth. So the nice thing is that 80%, when we dug a little bit deeper, are players that pretty much constitute about 98% of our match minutes. So that was very, very good for us. So we knew that the majority of the guys that are playing for us were fat adapted. Now at that point, I also said, well, let's say that wasn't the case. If you told me that I was able to implement this diet and that 9 of the 11 players on the field every Saturday were fat adapted, I would have been happy. I would have been quite happy. So we were excited about that, but we said that's not good enough. And so we've done things. We've incorporated new bits of resources into our program. You guys have met the Pangea guys outside, and we're paying for their service now for the players to have ready-made meals that we know that we're not going to have to worry about the carbohydrate content of the meals that they're eating, whether it's snacks, whether it's full dinners. We feel like we're complementing this well, and we're getting ready to do this survey again to see where we're at, and so that's something we're really excited about. But now this is where the proof was in the pudding. So in 2014, that was the year before we implemented the diet. I was here for about the last 2 months of that particular year, and I was just there to observe how the program was being run and how we were looking physically. And so if you look at this top section, just in total distance covered, 111.6 kilometers together as a team in a 90-minute match is not bad. That's not counting the goalkeeper, which Peter's probably looking at this and thinking that's not very good, but because most stats include the goalkeeper, we chose not to include the goalkeeper. We want to just look at field players. And 111.6 is actually very good. And again, we're trying to work in the margins, and we knew it was going to be difficult to make big differences. But as we moved through the years, all we saw was consistent increases in the amount of distances that we're covering per year. And so far this year, we're 3/4 of the way through the year, and it's by far the most amazing year we've had in terms of distances covered. Not just when you're looking at total distance covered, but now when you're just looking at high-speed distance covered over 90 minutes by the entire team. Again, we're seeing year by year, we're seeing progressive changes in how well the team is doing on the field. Now, these are averages, right? This is averages for the entire year. You have your ups and downs based on seasons. The summer months are very, very difficult for all teams in MLS, but in this particular case, when we're starting to get to this 2018 season, I think we're starting to see the benefits of a culture that we've been able to put in place. And at this point, it's nice to see that the players actually police the culture themselves. And so I think that the stats are showing that we're doing some things in a very good way, not just with diet, also with our training regimen. But but this wouldn't be possible if we weren't being fueled well, so we're really happy about that. 2018 has seen the highest distance covered that we've ever covered as a team. Again, this is not counting goalkeepers, and the best we've done so far is 121 kilometers. I've seen teams, including the goalkeeper, that get nowhere close to 121 kilometers in a single game. 16 kilometers of high-speed running is fantastic, and I see Peter shaking his head there. We really feel like this is the stat that surprised us the most. I mean, we've been told that you can't produce power on fat. That it's the biggest drawback of trying to incorporate this diet into a soccer organization is that you can't produce speed, and we're not seeing that at all. We're not seeing it at all. Our players are actually preferring to consume less and less carbohydrates, even on match days. That's the feedback that I'm getting from them anecdotally. As we start to talk about recovery, which we'll talk about here in a second briefly, again, they continue to have better and better scores from the recovery standpoint as they decrease their daily carbohydrate intake. So I think the superstition surrounding it for most of the players that started in 2015 is dying down. It's evidenced by, we got a handful of guys that in some of the periodic ketone testing that we do are in and out of ketosis throughout these restrictive periods in the week. And that wasn't even our goal. My goal in incorporating this diet was not to be in ketosis with every player. It's for us to have fat-adapted players. That was the most important part of it. But because the players feel so good and they want to decrease their daily carbohydrate calories on their own, we're starting to see this fluctuation in and out of ketosis. But from an injury record, we're having one of our best years that we've ever had in terms of games missed due to injuries. And the overall results that we've seen collectively from on-field work, from our injury record, has told us that we're in a good place, and diet is a big part of it. 2015 was the last year that the league allowed us to have data on every team. So I wish I had this data for years after 2015, but this is the first year we incorporated the diet. And when we're compared to other teams now across the league, when it comes to total distance covered, high-speed running, we were clearly producing more distance. This was the goal. The goal was to try to be as fit as we could possibly be, work in these margins and make a real difference. And I think these results year after year is what keeps the culture going. So we were really happy with the results we saw when we were compared to the rest of the league. Here are some individual stats. I wanted to be able to include this player's name because he's an incredible guy, but to understand the progress this guy's made has been fantastic. I think as players get older, they have a stigma that they can't do as much, and our goal with this individual is to change his physiology, change his mindset, and I think together the two have been fantastic. And as he's gotten older, he's been able to maintain such a high level of work rate on the field, and his diet's been a big part of that. 2018 so far, in terms of statistics, he spent a little bit of time. He had an unfortunate collision that kept him out of a large majority of games this year. But overall, when he's fit, when he's playing and he's in a rhythm, he doesn't look like a 33-year-old player. We know that for sure. So here's some individual stats that have supported what we're doing. And then the only real recovery statistic that I can give you is that we take perceived rates of soreness on the players just subjectively every day. But I just took this particular data from the very first training day after a match. Normally Sundays were off. We play Saturday. Sundays were off, and Monday is usually the first day of training. So I just said anecdotally, I want to take a look at what are their perceived rates of soreness from 1 year to the next on this particular day, this one day when the first day back to training after games are finished. And progressively, they're just continuing to give us lower and lower scores in terms of the soreness they feel the first day they come back to training. And again, this was one of the biggest things I read from the work in the research up to this point, was that there's this huge evidence of decreases in inflammatory markers and evidence that just as we take these large carbohydrate molecules, these substances that are causing such chronic inflammation throughout the body, really puts us in a position to be able to do more work to be able to recover faster and continue to perform at an elite level. And we have no reason to believe that's not the case based on what we're seeing. These are some testimonials, and I wanted to try to take testimonials from a wide array of the people that are on our roster. And the first player is an American player that's been with us for 4 years. He's been in the program for a very, very long time. He's one of those players that we talked about that's in and out of ketosis. And just as an anecdote, this player is somewhere around 70 to 80 grams of carbohydrates on the day of the game. That's where he prefers to be, which is much different than the 400 grams we were suggesting conventionally a few years ago. So he says, I will never go back to eating the way I used to. And he said, that's the only quote you need from me, Steve, so I left it alone. Player B is the same player that I showed you the statistics of. He says, I am an older player now. My joints do not have the soreness as much. I feel my recovery is much better. I wish I knew this when I was younger. So he's a South American player. And then the last player is a new player to our system, just joined us this year. And he said, I had never heard of eating this way. I just feel better. I can't tell you why. Again, it's the reasons why our culture continues. I think the players themselves are able to incorporate new players quite well, because this is a very, very difficult part of becoming a new player with us. The diet is very, very different, and they've done a great job of helping these new players acclimate to the team and to the rest of the group. And that's it for me, guys. The one thing I want to end with is just make sure that I thank Dr. Volek for, the work that he's done in consulting with me. Our very first conversation came at the end of 2014, and I would not have implemented this diet as quickly as I did if I didn't know that I had him in my backyard. So I'm very thankful to you. I'm thankful to Taryn Sapper, who early on, Taryn did all of our menus, thousands of menus over and over and over again, and they've been valuable resources. And then I just figured I just need to just take one of his staff members. So we did that. I just poached one of his staff members, Jay Short. Jay, are you in the room? There he is in the back. And Jay's been with us for almost 2 years now. But the three of you guys together have been an incredible asset to us. And as far as this aspect of our performance platform is concerned, they deserve a tremendous amount of credit. So that being said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Bruckner, who, this is actually nice to be on the same sideline as you, Peter. In Liverpool, we actually spent many years on the opposing sidelines, him on the dreaded red side, my on the holy blue side. And but I've followed his work from afar since we've been apart, and it's a pleasure to be up here with you. Dr. Peter Bruckner, guys.